Everyone knows that art is subjective. Music, film, television, paintings, and much more can be captivating to the eyes and ears of many, while others may find said media to be negative or unresonant with them. This is expected as people will have their reception towards a certain thing and it can branch into many differing perspectives. In the world of film, that is very true, as people can walk into something with hype, curiosity, uncertainty, and feelings that range from one end of the spectrum to another. One of the movies that demonstrates this is Speed Racer, released in 2008, a movie based on the manga from the 1960s that follows the racer's family and explores the corruption behind sports. Now, this movie has been quite a favorite of mine for a while now, and growing up, it was just always a treat just to see this movie for its flashing colors, its visuals, and overall the racing aspect to this. But growing up, I began to appreciate more of the narrative side of things, like how this movie taps into the importance of having a well trusted and communicative family, and while also exploring the greed and the corruption that goes behind sports, a topic that's very true in the modern day with like the likes of soccer, American football, basketball, hockey, and all these other sports that we're familiar with. Now, around the time of its release, this movie had received a 42% rating on Rotten Tomatoes from a collective 218 critic reviews, while audiences gave it an overall lukewarm 60% rating. The consensus from critics at the time was that for its target audience, they would be amazed and find adorations for this film in some way. However, if you were someone who was going to this film blind or unfamiliar with the source material, the movie would fall flat through its quote, toxic admixture of computer-generated frenzy and live-action torpor succeeds in being almost simultaneously genuinely painful. The aesthetic equivalent of needles in eyeballs, and weirdly benumbing, like eye candy laced with lidocaine, or a misstep of epic proportions, an overbearing mix of candy-coated visuals and an incoherent plot. Though somewhat more positive, the audience reception of this movie also had some who shared the same thoughts and feelings towards this film. While reading the reviews of this film, however, there has been a clear distinction between a review filled with constructive criticism and flat-out uninformative comments that just come out as hate. One audience review said, "God recommended this as a pretty entertaining B-movie by my stoner friend, and I sort of see where they're coming from. Overall, though, I can only really recommend this for kids for the cartoony action and characters. I wouldn't for anyone else since the plot just makes my eyes glaze over from having no stakes. It runs way too long and the CGI is pretty outdated without an interesting style. It's all just overly glossy with blown out lights." Another said, "I like racing, but it's a kid's film, not for me." This one review also is one to behold. This movie is just never ending CGI, and the CGI aged pretty bad. Spy Kids 3D level. The best of them being one of two movies that I actually walked out of. This movie should have a warning. Watch it if you use drugs. As you can see, there is a clear distinction between someone who clearly sees the movie for what it is, but openly and understandably listing their criticism towards the execution, CGI, and overall narrative of this film, even if it's to the most minute detail, or very lack of there, for that matter. But at least it stacks up somewhat compared to someone who just spews out unintelligible review. Why do I bring all this up? Well, because earlier this month came the release of Hurry Up Tomorrow, a film by Trey Edward Schultz, starring Abel Tesfaye, otherwise known as the superstar The Weeknd, Jenna Ortega, and Barry Keoghan, and its reception is looking very similar to the reception of Speed Racer. This film is a companion piece to an album released by The Weeknd under the same name that adds a new layer and piece to an era that has been running about 9 months now as of writing this. The album has received widespread acclaim for its introspective lyricism while dabbling in many genre-defining songs. This movie is under the notion of a psychedelic thriller following, quote, a musician plagued by insomnia is pulled into an odyssey with a stranger who begins to unravel the very core of his existence. Now, as I hinted at earlier, the reception of this film from critics has been quite negative, as the consensus is that this is a film with style and no substance, a film with a very lacking plot, a film that acts as a cinematic ego trip of the lead actor and much more. While the audience reviews are far more positive than the critics, some reviews claim that the film is held back by bad acting, narrative decision that doesn't make sense in reality, a way to advertise an album that came out months prior. That said, mental struggles or sleep paralysis aren't a big deal, that The Weeknd should stick to music, and that the film is a vanity egotistical film. Having seen the film 3 times, I believe that this film was quite misunderstood and that there is a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to this movie, but there is a grander point that has to be addressed. The purpose of this video isn't to review the film, but this will act as a way to clear the air about things that are getting tossed around like it's the truth when it's clear that some of this criticism is just blatant hate, as it's clear to distinct someone who hasn't seen the film and someone who has and gives actual constructive feedback and opinion. It's an issue that has been recurring for a lot of films and media these days and has been apparent forever now. I will be tapping into the reactions from both the general audience, the critics, and the fan base of The Weeknd to present the differing opinions and outlook on this film. Before I continue with this analysis, to anyone who hasn't seen the film, I will be tapping into spoiler territory to explain said scenes and all to counter some of the quote criticism I've taken note of. So if you haven't seen the film, I suggest watching the movie before embarking on the rest of this video. It's important to go into this film with an open mind, as with what I'm going to say and touch on in this video, you will either like it or dislike it, and that's perfectly okay, so long as you go into this with an open mind, of course. With all that being said, let's dive into the reception iceberg of Hurry Up Tomorrow, and see what criticism follows as hate or actual constructive feedback. To say a movie has no plot is a very bold claim in itself, and it would take someone insane to make a film that has no narrative. But this movie, almost like every film, has a plot that is quite linear to understand if you were to put 2 and 2 together. Now, I'll try to simplify the story as much as I can for right now before going to detail the specifics and the many interpretations that can be made of the film. The narrative follows a vision of The Weeknd / Abel Tesfaye, who is slowly starting to slip deeper into his regrets, trauma, and heartbreak following a breakup from a woman who is left ambiguous for us to depict. We start the film with a voicemail from a woman who is breaking up with Abel, which we then cut to seeing Abel staring in a mirror undergoing a vocal exercise. Then proceeds to drink and work out before his staff enter to get him prepared for a concert, and he essentially hypes himself up to the stage. Following another day of performing as The Weeknd, he begins to sense his true colors and emotions seeping back in. He covers these negative thoughts and feelings under the persona of The Weeknd, who performs for thousands, parties, does drugs, and has had a history of substance abuse. It isn't helped by the fact that Lee, played by Barry Keoghan, who acts as the manager for Abel, tends to quote-unquote help by doubling down in this lifestyle of his persona. While all this is going on, Anima, or Annie as she is called in the movie, played by Jenna Ortega, is lighting her house on fire and is on the run while having tickets to see The Weeknd perform. She would steal gasoline and essentially make her way to her destination to see our favorite artist perform. While Anima makes her way to see The Weeknd perform, Abel and Lee are flying to their next destination, and Abel looks a bit distraught. Actually, more than distraught. This is because of the voicemail seemingly haunting him, and Lee questions him. Abel tries to get Lee to call this now past lover, and Lee tries to resist this until Lee finally calls her, but to no answer. Lee tries to reassure him by offering some substance to calm him down. However, amidst all this, Abel begins to struggle internally as he faces sleep paralysis, begins to question why his now past lover isn't answering the phone. And following the news that his voice was beginning to be more and more strained, he initially calls off the performance as he tells Lee that he can't sing. Lee perfectly demonstrates this ill-intended notion that he must go on and continue the show as his fans came all the way here for him, and to them he is their light and inspiration. Finally, he gives him the drugs to amp him up, but Abel begins to slip more and more as he begins to finally lash out his feelings and thoughts in a voicemail to his past lover. He goes out to perform as per usual, but this time it's more sluggish, shaky, and off-putting as it's clear his substance abuse, his inner turmoil, his fears. Everything begins to consume him until he loses his voice and his grasp of reality sinks deeper as he tries to go on only to strain his voice furthermore, culminating what all of this fear, traumas, and regrets have brought him up until this point as a performer and person. But then Abel sees Anima in the crowd, and there's this sense of familiarity, like they know each other. Abel runs backstage and decides to run away from the venue as he doesn't want to be surrounded by anyone at this moment. Anima sneaks up backstage to find him, and ultimately, Abel and Anima bump into each other. They both embark on a ride towards a small amusement park, and noticeably, Abel begins to feel more happy, joyous even to as far as to display childlike behaviors with Anima, as if he feels distant and free from his persona for this moment in time. Ultimately, Abel and Anima begin to drive back to the hotel only to see Lee on the sidewalk, and to avoid Lee, Abel chooses to stay at another hotel with Anima. Abel at the hotel plays a song to Anima, and she resonates to this song, as she expresses some personal struggles and her journey, and you can see that Abel resonates with what she is saying, and ultimately, they spend the night together. In comes a new day, and Abel wakes up seeing that, well, people are worried for him, and that the demand of the weekend calls back to him as his phone begins to blow up. All the while hearing Anima sing in the shower, specifically the song he previewed earlier. Abel has breakfast with Anima, but it's clear Abel is still focused on his past lover and essentially continues with the show as he gets ready to go wherever this tour takes him, quote unquote. Suddenly, Anima gets a call from her mom, and she is hesitant to answer. Anima asks Abel if she could tag along with him. But Abel, in a condescending way, hopes to see her there, in a way that comes off as, hope to see you there if you pay for it. Abel then asks Anima if she's going to answer her phone, and eventually she does, and her mom is seemingly upset at her, supposedly about burning her house down, and after hanging up, she breaks down. Abel looks disturbed and uncomfortable that she is having this breakdown, and ultimately, Anima questions why he is looking at her the way he is, and questions why Abel doesn't bring her along, and that she is trying to help him. Abel, after trying to keep calm about the situation, tells her bluntly to shut up and tell her that he has a tour to follow and that essentially life goes on. Except Anima bashes Abel with a champagne bottle, knocking me out cold. This is when we enter the surreal, dreamlike psychedelic sequence where Abel wakes up the same way we saw earlier, except his phone is cleared of any context, and nothing is the way it seems. He hears Anima singing in the bathroom as we heard before, but when he looks inside this time, she isn't in the bathroom. Confused, he explores the penthouse and goes outside to see how empty the world is. He begins to be terrified by the surreal nature of what's going on and goes on an elevator looking to go back up to his room, except the elevator takes him deeper into the depths of the hotel. He lands on a floor where it is pitch black at first, but after shining his phone flashlight, he sees a tunnel and ultimately chooses to explore, and after leaving the elevator, the doors close, and he is essentially locked in this tunnel. He hears a girl crying and eventually stumbles upon her presence, and as he gets closer, the girl jump scares him, and the sight of her scares Abel beyond comprehension. And he runs deeper into the tunnel until he sees himself in the dark, snowy oasis where he sees a big flame before him. He sits and tries to make himself warm, and that's when he looks to his side and sees his child self beside him. And tears begin to fall on Abel's face as he sees his younger self, leaving us with this sense of importance and this epiphany sense that comes to Abel's mind. Abel wakes up in the hotel tied up, and Anima tries to get Abel to open up about his fears, regrets, and all that has shaped him. Abel is hesitant to open up and chooses to stray away from the truth, and that's when Anima begins to play the Weeknd's music, highlighting that behind the poppy ravey music, there is this layer in the lyricism showcasing loneliness, heartbreak, and more, that lets Anima to connect the dots, that Abel had a lover that was seeing him for who he truly was, and that she was there for him, until his chaotic, problematic, broken persona was what ended up killing their relationship. Before Anima could play another song, Lee ended up finding where Abel is, and Anima kept Abel shut from screaming by trying to suffocate him with a pillow. Anima and Lee end up having a huge argument that ultimately results in a physical confrontation between Anima and Lee, in which Anima comes up on top by stabbing Lee in the neck. Lee bleeds out to death, and Abel is left to see his manager dead on the floor. Anima begins to pour gasoline on Abel and the bed, and is ready to light Abel on fire until he sings the very song he previewed earlier as his dying words, presumably, ultimately acting as a confession piece about everything. After singing this song, Anima sets him free and lights a fire in the penthouse where he was stuck. The movie ends in a twist showing Abel leaving the scene, transitioning back to the backstage where he started, giving the notion that the whole movie was in his head, and he is a changed man, looking at himself for the first time truly. Now, there is a lot to unpack with this film, as many of the scenes in this film either hold long shots to emphasize connection and importance, but also there are scenes that are so fast paced and psychedelic that it all adds to the thought that there is more to what is happening than it seems. Given the context of the ending of the film, you're left to put together that the characters of Lee and Anima, the characters that we've seen during the course of this film, are personifications of Abel's psyche. Lee representing the ego and ultimately the destructive nature and persona of the Weeknd, while Anima represents the true self but also shadow of Abel's psyche, as she acts as the metaphor for Abel's repressed traumas, regret, and all these feelings that have culminated during the course of this movie. This is more evident than ever. The name Anima refers to a concept in Jungian psychology where the Anima acts as the unconscious feminine archetype in a man's mind. So with all this in mind, you begin to see this film differently, as this acts as a psychological study of the Weeknd, and specifically Abel Tesfaye's mind. It changes the context of a lot of scenes, as the scenes between Abel and Lee can be interpreted as a way of Abel relying on his persona to get through his stress, anxiety, regret, and essentially everything that he's going through in the film. One of those scenes is the scene in the plane where Lee sees something bothering Abel, and Lee pinpoints the thought to the fact that his past lover has called things off with him. Lee expressively says that he needs to relax and not worry about this woman, except Abel is eager for Lee to call her, and so hesitantly Lee calls her only for her not to pick up, and Abel begins to break down. And ultimately, Lee's solution to calming him down is this cocktail he made, and Abel takes it. Slowly, Abel feels this false euphoria and calmness after taking the substance that Lee made. You get the feeling that it won't help him in the long term, though. Another scene is the moment when Abel tells Lee that he can't perform because he is stressed and can't sing, quote unquote. But Lee overhypes him and tries to reassure him that he's an inspiration to many and that fans have come all over the world to see him. Ultimately, Lee offers Abel a drug substance that will do the trick, quote unquote. Ultimately, Abel gives in and once again puts himself to more drugs and substances, which drowns him deeper into all that pressure and negative thoughts and emotions brewing up in his mind. There is this clear notion that the representation of the Weeknd's destructive nature, persona, and ego is in the form of Lee, as the solutions that Lee presents to Abel are substance, drugs, and methods that will ultimately bite him back later. What's more interesting is that it's clear his solutions to his inner turmoil were to dilute back into this destructive lifestyle of his to cope. One of the stories that inspired this film is Misery, a book written by Stephen King, which inevitably got its own film adaptation. And one of the metaphors made in this story is the struggles of addiction, as the villain Annie Wilkins in the film is depicted by King as a representation of his cocaine addiction. And Paul Sheldon, the main character and fictional author of this tale, relies on the care of Annie despite her actions torturing him, essentially. Now, as I was writing, I just noted that the female-led characters in Misery and Hurry Up Tomorrow are named Annie, so I guess the inspiration is more time than it seems. There are clear differences between the two tales. As for one, Annie or Anima in Hurry Up Tomorrow acts in a way as a guiding light and is the part of the subconscious need for Abel to face himself, whereas Annie in Misery is characterized as having an unstable, obsessive personality and demonstrates the extreme lengths that a parasocial relationship can bestow on someone. One of the scenes that perfectly displays this concept and change in context is that scene in the hotel between Abel and Anima, where Abel presents his unreleased song that is formed to be one of a confession. And as Anima lightly breaks down, she describes how her dad left her and her mom at a young age. And at some point over the years, Anima decided to run away and make a name for herself out in the world. But deep down, she feels alone despite the life-changing journey she seemingly had. This ultimately leaves Abel looking at Anima as if he can resonate with what she is saying. Now, when you first watch the scene, you're left to feel emotional and empathetic for the life summary that Anima presents, and left to question why Abel could relate to this. But after watching, knowing the big twist that the whole odyssey was in his head, you're left to wonder if what Anima said in the scene was actually what Abel went through. And it's made evident knowing that Anima was a part of his subconscious, relaying his upbringing and how he truly felt. Another scene that presents this true perspective and hidden layer of this film is the amusement park scene. Noticeably during the whole course of the film, Abel has been getting more and more miserable as his persona and association with Lee has bestowed more inflated stress and issues for him, which led to his voice giving out. But the minute he spends time with Anima, it's like a switch flips. Because after his voice loss, it's like the persona shifts to this passenger seat in his mind, and his true nature and self comes out as he displays inner childlike behavior with Anima, a part of him that we haven't seen during the whole movie up to this point. Once again, the Anima is meant to express our true emotional side and the depths of our hearts. So with this in mind, it further cements the idea that Lee is representative of the fame, ego, and despair that comes with the Weeknd, while Anima brings out who he is deep down slowly. I bring all this up to reinforce that the film is very abstract in approach, as there are layers to this film that can be interpreted in many ways, such as the way Lee and Anima talks to Abel, as if it feels like he is talking to himself, or at least parts of himself that he is either relied on or hasn't ventured in confronting himself within his psyche. The main inspiration of this film, Persona, directed by Ingmar Bergman, is a psychological drama film that explores the concept of Carl Jung's psychology of a social mask to hide one's true self. This is evident in the film where Elizabeth and Alma, two of the main characters in this tale, are interpreted to be the two aspects of the same person, and just like the name, the beauty yet sadness behind the film is how we hide behind the persona to shy away from our inner demons and struggles. Hurry Up Tomorrow in a new way tries to dive into the concepts that Carl Jung has tapped into and concepts that have been referenced in other films such as Persona and Misery. Hurry Up Tomorrow, for better or for worse, chooses to follow a narrative that is set up to be deciphered in differing ways by leaving things rather open-ended. Now, whether the execution of said concepts and narrative are done well, that's up for you to decide. But what's important above all about this is that it feels disingenuous to call a film flawless just for not spoon-feeding the viewer information, as films like Persona and Misery challenge the viewers of who's right and wrong, what is reality and what isn't. Are these characters their being or representative of something deeper? These are questions that are presented similarly in Hurry Up Tomorrow in the form of metaphors and personifications displayed through characters like Anima and Lee, and overall add more to the narrative and personal nature that has been built up through the description and interviews for this film. That all being said, the nature of this film is so complex that to a regular moviegoer, the film might present itself as hard to watch the first time around. There are even those within the Weeknd's fan base who had trouble understanding, as the sequencing of the film might come off as unconnected or different for many. What doesn't help either is the very simple yet ambiguous nature of the synopsis of the film, where it doesn't hint at the true nature of the plot being a facade happening within the film. End of the day, this film has a plot with layers upon layers that is under the disguise of characters or objects that clearly emphasize that this piece of media is constructed to be abstract, and we're left to wonder the true narrative of this film, and that, for one, is something beautiful. Now, if art is subjective to the eye and ears of many, it is subjective to formulate an opinion on the artist and the many aspects to put into the art. For example, in a painting, the composition, subject matter, the choice of a brush used, the use of color, or the type of paint, or the vision for said painting are bound to be evaluated in many opinionated ways. One may see the technique of someone's art as masterful, sharp, exquisite, and perfect, whereas another may see it as too elegant, perhaps lacking in an aspect that could drive the art further, or perhaps a lack of cohesion or arrangement in elements within the painting. A film follows a similar notion where to bring it to life, you'll need a camera crew, lighting, stunt performers, storyboard artists, writers, producers, a director or two, editors, and actors. How one perceives the aspects that go into the making of a film is also left for us to see if they work or not. How one is to judge a painting or film is by thoroughly seeing the ins and outs of said media. Now, why am I rambling on about the subjectivity of all these aspects that I have brought up so far? Before I go further, I should emphasize that the issue isn't that someone has an opinion of one way or the other. After all, whether we like something or not, that is okay. And just like a lot of media, we are bound to see things in a slightly different way. The issue that I have been seeing that has been very notable for this film especially is the way people have formulated and processed their opinions. More specifically, judging a film and coming to a conclusion that said film is poorly made because of one's performance based on a small clip swirling around the internet. This is a scenario that happens to be the case with Hurry Up Tomorrow, where this scene of Abel essentially starts lashing out towards Anima in a hotel scene after displaying a depressive, erratic moment to herself, in which Abel tells Anima to
Shut the fuck up! Shut up! What are you doing? What the fuck are you doing?
Now, without context, sure, the scene could be rather silly, funny even, and the way Abel reacts to this is bound to be meme material. With context, however, you realize the importance of this scene as Abel tries to be patient and somewhat reasonable with Anima, even if his personal ways start to seep back in. But the more Anima becomes erratic, it only makes more sense and is understandable why Abel reacts the way he does in the scene. Why he is so uncomfortable and uneasy with her presence and how she is, well, behaving in the scene. Now, in terms of the performance and delivery, this is where it gets a bit tricky, as this film is unlike anything that Abel has done before. This would mark a perfect time to discuss Abel Tesfaye's prior acting. Now, for the longest time, Abel has only done music videos under the persona of The Weeknd, who displays this chaotic lifestyle which deals with him partying, doing drugs, and alcoholism, who is also riddled with heartbreak, loss of self, the effects of fame, and uncertainty. Under the notion of music videos, it works as it is tied to the music of his creation, and it adds more layers to said music with visualizers or stories attached. However, music videos aren't as close to the grandiosity and potential that a television series or film can bring. Abel appeared as somewhat of a cameo in the film Uncut Gems, starring Adam Sandler, who played a version of The Weeknd during the earlier years of his music career. Abel's real first acting gig would be in the form of The Idol, released in 2023, starring Lily Rose Depp and himself, alongside Susanna Son, Troye Sivan, Jane Addams, and many more. The series was severely panned, heavily scrutinized, and memed on so much that it was being labeled the worst show of that year. The frenzy it caused on socials was one to be seen, and it's especially considering that there were even diehard fans who openly admitted the show was not the greatest. One of the many things that was being ridiculed during the discourse of the show was Abel's performance as Tedros in the series, and it was apparent given all the clips revolving around his performance. The most notorious scene being the scene of him pressing a store employee for gazing at Jocelyn, Lily Rose Depp's character, multiple times. Now, the clip within and without context is quite funny, and to be honest, the acting in that scene wasn't the greatest. It would be fair to say also that some of Abel's performance in this series was very poor and at best decent. Now, the character of Tedros is depicted as the sleazeball, a manipulative and toxic con man, serving to act as a terrible influence on Jocelyn's life during the show. A lot of the bad associations that came with Abel's acting during this time were the fact that people were believing that the character, or in other words, the personality of Tedros, was one-to-one with how Abel behaves in real life, given the knowledge that Abel co-created and co-produced the series. The thing is, though, it doesn't make realistic sense how one is to associate the personality and distinction of a fictional created character with an actual person, especially when Abel himself didn't have any directive or writing control of the series. All the man could have done was see the creation of something that wasn't fully his. Ultimately, the damage was done, and his career reputation was hit due to the reception of the series, and to many, any second chance of Abel's acting to be deemed was right off the bat out of the picture. I will bring up this point later though, as it will become more important. Still, the announcement of the development of a new movie, which would end up being Hurry Up Tomorrow, starring Abel, Jenna Ortega, and Barry Keoghan, made by Trey Edward Schultz, came before The Idol premiered, and before the show, everyone was excited despite all the drama going into the series. However, following the conclusion of the show, the sentiment became quite pessimistic given the overall reception to the series. But as we got more information about the film earlier this year, we learned that Abel was essentially going to be playing himself, or at least a version of himself that would be the main star of this film, following the release of his album under the same name. It would become evident that this film was a personal and passionate project of his, long in the making. More on this later. Now, with the movie out, what is the overall reception of Abel's acting now that the film has been out for a bit? Honestly, from the looks of it, it appears to be very mixed. Now, I've already discussed the notion of the no plot criticism that has been one of the main quote-unquote critiques of this film. But opinions on the acting have been less talked about, at least in comparison to The Idol, where it was a non-stop laughing joke. From reading tweets, reviews, and all sorts of conversation regarding Abel's performance, diehard fans loved it and adored the glimpse of a more human, down-to-earth nature of Abel that no one has seen before. As for general audience, it has ranged from people liking his performance, or at the very least, can give him props that his acting has improved in some ways, to very little, if any, improvement from his acting abilities from The Idol. Here's the thing though. It's really hard to critique the acting abilities that are displayed in this film, where Abel essentially plays a version of himself, which taps into this tricky situation in knowing what is reminiscent of how he acts in reality and what is displayed in a more dramatized or fictional way. Going back to the scene in which Abel starts telling Anima to shut up after her breakdown moment in the hotel, you are left to wonder if the way Abel says this is actually how he would shout this out to someone. Having listened to interviews and how he has spoken within film and television, he very noticeably has a very soft-spoken tone and voice. So the way he expresses emotions may be different from someone who has a very deep, melodramatic voice. It's similar to the scenario where you might see someone thinking they're going to sound a certain way, only to sound completely different than what you thought initially. So really the judgment of the scene is partially hard to perceive, as well as the other scenes he's in. Now this is off script, as I'm updating this right now during recording, but when you really think about that scene now, when Abel shouts at Anima, now knowing that Anima is basically a part of himself, you begin to see in a different lens that, in a way, the way he's like talking down on Anima is like this sad notion that he's talking down on himself, like his true self, saying that, it's his way of like repressing his own feelings and care of his like well-being in the grand scheme of things. And it just shows like how far the persona has driven the course of his life up until that point. Once again though, I must mention the fact that how you perceive Abel's or anyone's performance for that matter is okay, as so long as it is in fair judgment and having seen the full film in its entirety. It's just worth noting that people are judging a whole film without having seen the film based on one clip surfacing around the internet. From that perspective, it doesn't come off all that informative to say a film is poorly made because of a potentially poorly acted scene. It also undermines the rest of the scenes that have Abel displaying many emotions, such as the bathtub scene displaying the levels at which sleep paralysis can bring on someone. When he sees only the shadow and glimpse of a bathroom in which he wakes up erratically, gasping for air, trying to retrieve his inhaler for air, almost like he is having a panic attack. The scene plays out in an unsettling, suspenseful nature until he wakes up and extreme adrenaline and fear-inducing feelings crank up exponentially, which is thanks to Abel portraying what sleep paralysis does to someone. Another scene that I think showcases Abel's acting to a personal degree is the surreal dreamlike scene. There is barely any dialogue in this sequence, as he is left in this nightmare situation where he's alone in the world, and progressively you see Abel feeling lost and uneasy at first. It becomes more unsettling as he steps outside of the hotel and sees nothing but empty streets, and he becomes noticeably more worried. Once we get to the part of him in the elevator and tunnel, you see him understandably terrified and more uncertain of what's beyond this point. This reaches a peak where Abel encounters this crying woman in the tunnel and ultimately jump scares him, leaving him terrified as to what he is seeing, and runs down the tunnel to find himself in this secluded snowy space with a big fire lit up. He's cold and uncertain until he sees his child self. And you visibly see him emotional, but also a layer of him realizing as he gazes at his child self. This scene is a particular showcase the depth of emotion that Abel has in the film. Reverting to the hotel scene, yes, while it is more one of the weaker scenes of this film, I think in context and with the portrayal of him in mind, you can see why this scene is presented the way it is. Just as I mentioned earlier, it is okay to critique a film for its performances, cinematography, and everything displayed. And it's okay to react to things differently because opinions are okay, and after all, how things are executed might not appease everyone. It's just the fact that people are coming to these conclusions having not seen the film and chewing on scenes of old and new from said actor or performer. That's the unfortunate reality with how people get first impressions or information nowadays, as many forms of media, whether it be film, music, designs, and more, have been falling victim to this approach, where people see something from afar without full context and judge for the crumbs they can pick up. You see it across news reports, socials like TikTok and Twitter, and gossip now that it's become the norm, almost the bandwagon on something that lacked a true understanding or context to something specific. There is a clear intent for a certain group of people to talk about this film for likes, attention, and that field of approach, and that's unfortunate to see. End of the day, it leaves many to question the validity of the perception of this film. And thankfully, some people are reviewing this film to the best of their ability, with actual critique if discussed. And in the case of the acting, it's great to see in light and talk the areas that shine the brightest and need improvement for a specific actor in said film. Abel's acting going forward in the perception of many will be mixed and polarizing. And until otherwise, this perception won't change for a while. Until possibly the next acting role he lands on. I will note before ending this section that Jenna's and Barry's acting in this film has also received a bit of criticism, to downright hate, for a similar approach that one clip seems to shape a judgment for a film that people clearly haven't seen. The same notion I've mentioned for Abel's acting similarly applies to their acting, as ultimately you have to see the full product to have a proper vision and perspective on said product. With all this being said, this isn't the only criticism being thrown around this film, and it's quite fascinating about this film in specific. Before I discuss this point, it's worth mentioning that the concept of a film tied to an album as a companion piece has been done before. These movies stand to reinforce and further cement the albums for what they are narratively, thematically, sound, and more in a grandiose visual manner. To better explain why Hurry Up Tomorrow has this emphasis on the album being tied to the movie, it's best to talk about the films that have gone out their way to elevate their album and music with the creation of these companion pieces. For example, Pink Floyd's The Wall, an album released in 1979, would receive a film adaptation under the same name as the album and hit theaters on September 17, 1982. And is regarded as one of, if not the best film album tie-ins of all time, as the connections and thematics make strong metaphors through its visual and sound and design. Very little dialogue is present in the film, as the film prioritizes the songs from The Wall to drive the narrative. The film follows a depressive rock star named Pink, who is in a rough state of life, as the price of fame and traumatic events in his life are starting to weigh on him. As a result, Pink is left to form a coping mechanism to push through these events, thoughts, and feelings. However, this coping mechanism ends up being his downfall, and so he is left trying to free himself from the damage made from this approach to things that are effectively ruining his mental health. As I mentioned briefly, its themes are what really drive the film to be successful, as the movie doesn't shy away from tackling issues of depression, addiction, the price of stardom, abandonment, and rebellion against the higher-ups. It's also helped that the music is so filled with depth in its lyricism and sound that it backs up the points, flow, and purpose of the whole film. And that's to evoke a commentary of what the music industry and life of a rock star can bestow on someone when added with a troubling past and rocky mental. It's a very well-made, abstract film that, for its time, holds up still in the modern age. Another film that also ties into an album is Interstellar 5555, the story of the secret star system. This film debuted in 2003 and is a tie-in companion piece to Daft Punk's iconic Discovery album, released in 2001. The film is best depicted as an anime musical science fiction, and it's one of the charming aspects of this film, as it is a lot more ambitious and creative with its style and structure. The film is almost in the notion of a silent film, where there is no dialogue and not a whole lot of background music, the main audio being an entire album being played during the whole film, so much so that the main story beats coincide with the musical content. Now, this movie follows an alien music band that plays for the masses of many on an alien planet, and is all well until invaders kidnap the band to Earth, and it becomes a mission for a heroic yet big, loyal fan and soldier from the alien planet to rescue them and bring them home. The film may present itself to be simple and laid back hearing this, but watching the film, you see there is more to this film as it dabbles into themes such as exploitation of artists within the music industry, rediscovering one's true identity, love, and above all, how music is impactful and can transcend the many boundaries that allow said music to connect to people. It's a short yet compelling film that elevated the album with its cinematic visuals and storytelling that goes out of its way to express some rather complex topics. Lastly, one of the films that stands out when bringing up album tie-in films is Purple Rain by Prince. The album and film under the same title were released in 1984, a month apart from each other, as the development for both pieces were constructed roughly at the same time, which makes it all the more impressive how both pieces complement each other. The story follows a character named The Kid, played by Prince, a musician who is starting to gain some traction along his band, The Revolution. The Kid is trying to escape his troubled home life through music, as the kid's father is one of the core reasons for this escapism due to his mistakes and neglect, all the while trying to contend with a rival singer and maintaining an up and down relationship with another singer. This film is not at all subtle in displaying its thematic nature, as scenes would visibly take a new spin and perspective on what some songs mean, given a new light and context. These themes range from the film exploring one's overcoming of personal struggles, understanding of the music industry, misogyny, and the rocky nature of relationships, whether that be with family, friends, or significant others. One of the most notable scenes is when the kid goes out to perform Purple Rain in front of many, which is a dedication to his father. Without the film context, the song acts as a way to convey one's endurance during troubling times, with an emphasis on love, faith, and guidance. But given what happens in the film, despite all the torment that the kid's father bestowed onto him, despite all the mistakes that his father and himself has made up until that point, this song acts as a way of a confession almost, a song meant for forgiveness and redemption, and that makes the scene and song all the more resonating and intentful. Purple Rain as a whole emphasizes its connection between the music and film with a clear vision of how said music can evolve and be interpreted, visually and sonically. All these films that I've mentioned emphasize carrying strong layered themes and connecting the branches between album and film in captivating creative ways, so that it's clear that the music has a strong role within the film. It's why it makes sense that an artist would promote and emphasize the connection between an album and film, because there is intended importance that said album would play a role in how a film is structured and depicted. So when approaching Hurry Up Tomorrow, the similarities in how the album ties into the film are no exception, as songs from the album would be played during key moments of reference through visuals. Music in film tends to be more important to setting or establishing the mood or tone of specific scenes than most people realize. Most of us have learned minutely that music is meant to be a form of an additional layer to convey emotion, but also we tend to forget that songs can reinforce themes carrying meaning to a certain scene, or simply have a scene be representative of the song of choice. One of the more well-correlated scenes from the Hurry Up Tomorrow is the scene of a paralyzed Abel in the bathtub, seeing a shadowed figure in the corner of a bathroom. This mirrors the lyrics to one of his songs from his recent album under the same title called Baptized in Fear. The song talks about an experience that Abel had with sleep paralysis and how, as a result, the singer gets overwhelmed by past mistakes, regrets, traumas, and guilt. The meaning and significance of this song goes further, as the shadow referenced in the song is supposedly representative of death, or a stand-in for all the problems and past experiences essentially wrapped into one entity. And given what happens in the rest of the album, is depicted to the concept of Abel killing off the persona, an ego that effectively has slowly but surely in itself resulted in the destructive nature of the Weeknd. As I mentioned with the plot of the film, it's very clear that the movie has a similar outcome where Abel has to dig deep within himself and confront his inner demons, even if the pain might be too much. His psyche is so convoluted that it's taken the form of two characters, Anima and Lee. This is further proven to be true during the amusement park scene. What's interesting is that the song that plays later in this section of the scenes is Drive, which is one of the deep cuts from his latest album, which emphasizes this escape from being in stardom and being free from his persona and lifestyle of the Weeknd. The song represents the true nature of the amusement park scenes and why Nima is important in context to the song, as her character being the form of a reflection and representation of Abel's true feelings and emotional longing, his true self essentially. The song has Abel feeling the sense of being a child again, and within the context of the film, this is due to Anima's ability and presence to allow Abel to embrace his inner child. This is why in this section he's happier, free, and full of spirit as he lets himself blossom as his true self. The final example I bring up for this portion is the use of the title track within this film. Hurry Up Tomorrow within the album and movies focused on the concept that for Abel to change for the better to start anew, he must confront his past, make peace, and essentially confess to it all, so he can move on from the persona that essentially shaped his life. The track is essentially in development during the course of the film, highlighting key points during the film as the more he opens up, the more he begins to come to terms with what he has been meant to evoke for so long. The penultimate scene where Abel is tied in bed and nothing left to say, he is left to confess through the title track to set him free from it all. There is a true overarching importance in connecting the album and movie, as it highlights and offers more insight as to why scenes play out the way they do, as well as the hidden background and meaning to the scenes and even music. Now, to have the whole album play itself during a film realistically shouldn't be surprised given the nature that this film and album would be coinciding with each other. And while not all the songs were played in this film, there is still that emphasis that perhaps the songs have taken the form of specific scenes like the bathtub scene. Also, it's just strange to throw the reason that the music used in the film was also just to promote his album and nothing more. But the thing is that the film and album are meant to go hand in hand and are helping each other establish their existence. only for the criticism being made that the music inclusion was pointless or necessary and essentially as to what I will go over later as an ego fest film, as critics has deemed it. By this logic, the decision to have artists incorporate music into their film, even though there's clear intent, purpose, and importance behind these decisions, is egotistical, narcissistic, and self-obsessed to the eyes of many apparently. Just considering the music alone, however, the music is meant to serve as an additional layer to convey meaning and purpose to scenes, and it's clear given how tied the album and film are. It's keen on making sure the connection is there enough that we audiences can piece it together. What is interesting to note is that the album was released months before the film, but the movie inspired the album, as the movie was completed first before the album was fully realized and completed. And yet the album was used to promote the film heavily, and at that point you could argue the other way around. And given that this isn't the first time an artist has gone ahead to make an album tie-in film, it's tough to see the issue given how similarly in conception these films have approached certain themes, topics, and plot. Now, what could be argued is the critique that there were some missed opportunities to present more of the music to tie into the film, and well, that right there would be some genuine criticism. But to put the focus that this film was just promotion of an album tied in as one of the main reasons for this movie's downfall is not a valid form of criticism for this film to go off from. As a medium, film is flexible, like art, in displaying narratives and more through the use of focus and certain aspects or maintaining the balance of said aspects. In the case of this film, with the change in visuals like aspect ratios, lighting, and such, the music is one of the core driving factors of this film. And for a film with a major direct correlation between film and album, it's very much necessary to point out that the connection is necessary and clear as day. And if this were criticism in general, this would be going out to other films, as mentioned earlier, as artists like Pink Floyd, Prince, and Daft Punk would be called out for, which funny enough, has happened a bit previously when it's very well noted that the music is a core necessity in their respective films for a purpose. So to say the movie was used for promotion for the album is one, pointless given how the album is well connected to the film, and two, it just screams a disdain for artists integrating their works in other mediums. And if you thought this was the most disdainful, well, you'd be surprised to hear this one. Now, originally, I wasn't going to tap into this topic, as in the case of criticism, this should be a no-brainer. However, having seen some people question the sleep paralysis and the idea of one losing their voice as a singer, as people, I think it's an essential notion to discuss the ramifications and tie-ins to the bigger picture here, which is the world of mental health. One of the very key reasons that the film was made was due to a real-life incident where The Weeknd lost his voice during a concert at SoFi Stadium on September 3rd, 2022. Abel has gone on public record saying that the result of this incident was caused by numerous factors, including stress, anxiety, and self-imposed pressure. He also has gone on record to say that this incident triggered his sleep paralysis and was the deciding factor that led to his important self-reflection of his life, to figure himself out. The result of all this played a factor into the birth of this film and the album, as the contents within each piece act as a callback to core issues, thematics, and topics that the artist has hinted at during the course of his career, while introducing new talking points that speak more personally and past the persona that I've mentioned across the course of this video. Now, for those that don't know what sleep paralysis is essentially the stasis in which someone is awake, but their ability to speak or move is stunted, or other words, paralyzed. There are a plethora of causes and reasons for sleep paralysis, but the main ones being insomnia, PTSD, panic disorder, and or anxiety disorder. Sleep paralysis varies in many ways, as research has seen cases where people have hallucinations during this process, whereas others haven't dealt with any form of hallucination. While sleep paralysis is harmless, it is far more important than people realize, that sleep paralysis can be seen as a symptom of an underlying issue or mental health condition such as depression, stress, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. Especially in the long term, as emotional distress is enabled far significantly after sleep paralysis to produce more conflict within an individual. This is best displayed in the scene of Abel in the bathtub, where he is lying there unable to speak or move as he gazes across the room to see a shadowy figure in the corner of the bathroom. This showcases the surreal nightmare-inducing visual of what sleep paralysis can bestow on a person. Now, with sleep paralysis being seen as a symptom of a disorder or condition more generalized, it's worth diving into the core roots of where an issue might stem from, which is where this next point comes in. Now, picture this. Let's say you're a football player who is well-informed, top of the leaderboards, best in the world type perception. That person might be living gloriously, That is until they get into an injury that could see them suffer physically and mentally. It becomes far worse when, let's say, they lose their leg or arm. For them, it's like the end of their world, as they know those are the aspects needed to play ball. Another example would be an artist, as for many to draw is a gift or something that took time to master. All of it can be taken away as perhaps they lose an arm or hand, and in that case, it would be devastating as their livelihood would be centered around the importance of their arm or hand. For one to lose the thing or aspect that made them talented at what they do, it would be traumatic, depressing, anxiety inducing, and stress inducing. In the case of this film, for a singer to lose their voice, it comes with more repercussions than people realize, as losing one's voice can lead to the tearing of one's vocal cords and possibly permanent voice loss. One similar example of a situation which a singer suffers from a condition or situation where they have to be wary of their voice is Celine Dion, as she has gone in public news saying she suffers from stiff person syndrome, SPS. Stiff person syndrome is a rare autoimmune neurological disorder that causes muscle stiffness in the body, specifically the limbs and abdomen. It has been documented and reported for Celine Dion that the syndrome effectively put more of a strain and difficulty for the singer, as the syndrome altered how she controls her voice, so much that it resulted in her having breathing problems while singing. Celine has been evident in sharing her fears of the syndrome in professional and personal matters, and her fear of her losing her voice, which could potentially and effectively end her career. That's one of the fears that is explored in this film and speaks volumes in highlighting the importance of mental health. The pressure to put on a top-notch performance, to live a flashy, fast-paced lifestyle, to bottle up so much emotion and thought, it was only a matter of time before it all resurfaced drastically. The film could represent a similar direction and reflection of what happened, or at least the torment and core conflict brewing within Abel after the incident. It comes out very disingenuous to say the loss of his voice or the sleep paralysis is not a big deal or a topic all that interesting to explore, as it feels like a subtle way of saying aspects of mental health aren't that interesting or important. Given that this movie serves as a psychological study of the Weeknd, the film must explore mental health through the scenes displaying sleep paralysis and how it's part of the bigger picture that serves a purpose in the messaging that Abel wanted to get across in the film. In the film, sleep paralysis and insomnia are representative of the inner demons that continue to grow within Abel, reflective also in his behavior, especially the way he treats Lee and Anima, which is all the more saddening once you consider they are parts of his subconscious, as it's all the more self-destructive, and highlights the depression that is slowly starting to seep out. If you recall, it all comes crashing down during the second concert scene, as Abel falls more to his drinking and initiating drugs to, quote, help him, when in reality, it would have him further lash out as he takes out all of his emotion and thought in a voicemail to the lover that broke his heart. That's why it becomes a ticking time bomb, and inevitably when he loses his voice, as all the torment, inner demons, depression, anxiety, fear, stress, and everything comes crashing down, he is left there, lost and feeling alone. The build-up and the scene where Abel loses his voice represents the nature of one's mental health as personal and professional conflicts start clashing and push the goal by the end of the movie for Abel to find himself again and reflect upon all to make amends within. This is further evident through the many interviews for this film where the topic of mental health was one of the core focuses of this film. For example, this video interview of Abel and Trey Edward Schultz talking with Sally, a YouTuber who interviews top celebrities from many fields about their work and underlying issues, about personal issues that they have both faced and how that played into the development of the film. They had a vision and idea of putting these aspects together to tell a story about one's mind and mental health. Whether it was executed well or not, once again, that's for one to decide on their own. Still, at the very least, they are trying to get something across with this film, and that's the notion that sleep paralysis is a symptom of an issue far bigger, and that for one to lose their talent would be traumatic and terrifying. It's human, and it speaks volumes to someone like Abel and those with such incredible talent in many ways. Now, as an extra note, the film released during Mental Health Awareness Month, and it's quite fitting, as this film does tell the rebirth of one within, the confession that sets someone free from their past, the journey of one beginning to succumb to his demons until a certain moment opened his eyes to something beautiful, a new hope. Even after losing his voice, even after facing mental blocks and symptoms like sleep paralysis, even after facing heartbreak, after all that he's faced, everything, he was finally at the last moment able to find self-forgiveness and acceptance. This showcased Abel's mental health at its highest and lowest, as it showed a man who finally burned his persona down, the mask that held him back for so long, the walls that hid his true nature for so long, to be his true self again. And that for one is beautiful. It's just a shame that people will find this to be an ego fest. Hurry Up Tomorrow is a film that takes a deep dive into the mind of the Weeknd, or rather Abel Tesfaye, as one can slowly put together the true nature and importance that the film has for the artist and the message that can resonate with people. The film is very abstract in its topics, messaging, and plot points, which makes the possibilities of countless interpretations of the film all the more likely to be formed. Interestingly, the film touches on the aspects of vanity and ego and how they can be very self-destructive to an individual. What makes the criticism all the more ironic is how, by the end, and the overall core takeaway that is meant to be made of the film, is how one must overcome their vanity, ego, and persona by searching deep within themselves and confronting themselves to be free, to find their true self. As I mentioned in the past points up until now, the character of Lee is the embodiment of this persona, ego, which only makes Abel proceed in vain. And so, with him dying in the hands of Anima, it symbolizes far more than a simple character death because, well, that was in turn the death of that persona, that ego, that was only adding more fuel to the conflict within. That's why by the time you get to the end shot of Abel staring to the camera, it's a contrast to the first scene where you see Abel with this gaze of the same old, the persona and ego in control as his superstar life is put into display. But by the end, there's this look of change, bittersweetness, acceptance, and relief as this intentful journey shifted his perspective of himself and potentially his worldview now. To reiterate what I said previously, whether the execution of these concepts and scenes landed, that's up to opinion, and that's so long as it's done with proper context, thought, and understanding of this film, that, my friend, would be okay. Criticism at its core is to provide a review with the proper digestion, thoughts, and feelings of the film, especially as to what worked and didn't. However, the fine line between hate and criticism can be easily crossed, as it's pretty clear with scenes taken out of context, it can be used to fulfill a narrative constructed by others to align with this perspective. It is quite telling how apparent it is that there are people who are looking for the facts they want to hear and not the facts about the actual truth and nature of the thing they're discussing and focused on. Once again, it's important to know how one views something may differ from others, and that's okay, so long as it is done with proper respect and understanding of their outlook and understanding of said piece. There are clear arguments to be made of a film of this nature, and that's all well and normal. It just enters this strange territory where it's very noted and apparent as to what can be seen as pure arrogance, ignorance, and misunderstanding of something that one is choosing to talk about. There is a strong argument to be made that Hurry Up Tomorrow is quite misunderstood as a film, but that also the film will only resonate with certain groups of people, as the film requires the viewer to be open-minded and perceptive of the nature of deep, layered, psychedelic thriller stories, or rather being a fan of the Weeknd himself. It's meant to be a passion project, just like how Daft Punk, Prince, Pink Floyd, and Michael Jackson has approached their movies. And whether it sticks the landing for people, that's up to people to decide. But I believe it's important to walk away from any product with an understanding and constructively formulated thoughts of said product before embarking and then going off about something that you may have not had a proper understanding or judgment of. Tons of media will fall with false narratives, but floating around are the true reviews that give proper emphasis to that said media. Hurry Up Tomorrow may have not been given the kindest of words by most critics and will be mixed and polarizing for audiences, but it's a film worth being open-minded to. To end this off, I will give a review that a friend made about this film, as he gave it a 3 stars out of 5. Having seen this film as someone not big into the Weeknd or anything with my girlfriend, I was quite surprised by the ambition and thematics of this film. While the plot could have been stretched, explored a bit more for what it tries to accomplish though, it does so well enough. That said, I can see why the film isn't going over well with many people. It's committed to its hitting meaning structure, and that can fly over many people's heads. But for those who saw right through it, I think that's something worth taking note of. But for those who have been fans for such a long time, such as my girlfriend, it will serve as a love letter to those who have been around his journey for a while. For me, it'll have to sit more for me to see the full vision of the film. All I can say now is that I can imagine this film would be one of the most misunderstood films out there. Thank you guys for sticking through to the end. I hope you guys enjoyed my discussion of this film and the commentary of the reception of Hurry Up Tomorrow. If you are interested in me covering the albums or specific movies in particular, I will be sure to take into consideration any ideas for the future of this channel. Thank you guys and take care. Bye-bye.